The wind carried with it the smell of dust, sagebrush, and something else she could not name. Something wild that seemed to whisper of danger and untold stories. The land stretched wide, raw, and untamed, under a sky painted in colors of fire and fading gold. Her horse moved with a slow rhythm, hooves breaking the silence of the open prairie, though in her chest the silence was already broken by a storm she could not calm. She told herself again what she had sworn from the very start, that she would never forgive him, never trust him, never allow her heart to forget what had been taken from her people and her life. Yet even as the vow burned inside her, the thought of the Apache's dark eyes returned, steady and unreadable, and it shook her resolve more than she wanted to admit. The frontier was a place where lines blurred. Justice and vengeance walked close together, and survival left little space for softness. She had grown up with stories of raids, of burned homesteads, of families broken apart. The Apache were painted to her as shadows in the night, merciless and cunning, warriors of a land that did not want to be tamed. Every tale she heard as a child carved anger into her heart. So when fate set her path against his, she thought it was only natural to despise him. Her hatred was a shield, and she clung to it tightly. But shields grow heavy, and in the silent hours of night when she closed her eyes, she wondered if hate was only a mask for something far more dangerous. He had not spoken much when they first crossed paths, and maybe that was what unsettled her the most. Silence could cut sharper than words. His presence was like the desert wind, rough yet steady, brushing past without asking permission. His gaze did not flinch. His movements carried the weight of someone who had lived too close to the edge of life and death. To her, he was the embodiment of everything she had been warned against, and yet she found herself noticing details she wished she had not. The way his hands carried both strength and care when he handled his weapons or his horse. The way he seemed to listen to the earth itself, hearing messages in the rustle of leaves and the crackle of distant fire. She wanted to despise him fully, but her heart betrayed her by keeping account of every moment. The townfolk whispered about him. They spoke of the warrior who had walked away from his people, who carried the weight of two worlds and fit into neither. Some called him a traitor, others a ghost, but no one dared say it to his face. They feared him, yet they also relied on him when danger pressed too close. Because out on the frontier, enemies could turn into unlikely allies. She heard those whispers too, and tried to hold on to the bitterness that had always been hers. She told herself he was nothing more than a reminder of wounds that never healed. But the land had its own way of weaving stories, binding souls together even when they resisted. She remembered the first time his hand brushed hers, not by design but by necessity. It had been a moment of urgency, the kind that left no time for hesitation. His touch had been firm, steadying her when she nearly fell, and it sent a shock through her that rattled the walls of her vow. It was not tenderness that undid her, but strength that steadied her when she was most unprepared. She pulled back as though burned, angry at herself for feeling something she had promised never to feel. She told herself it was nothing, that her heart was foolish. Yet every time his shadow crossed hers after that, she felt that same blaze waiting for her to admit it. She had sworn to hate him, and for a time she managed it. But hate does not always hold its shape when tested by fire. Each passing day revealed pieces of him she had not expected, and against her will. Her heart began to see him not as an enemy, but as a man. A man who carried scars that did not always show, who lived with a quiet burden, who looked at the horizon as though searching for something forever out of reach. She saw the loneliness behind his silence, the guarded truth behind his eyes, and it frightened her more than the hatred ever had. The world around them was far from gentle. The prairie nights echoed with cries of wolves and the distant crack of gunfire. Raiders prowled, and the townsfolk tightened their grip on fear. She knew the danger was real, and that alliances often meant survival. Yet she also knew the cost of letting walls down, of forgetting the history written in blood between their peoples. She battled herself each time she looked at him, torn between duty to the past and the dangerous pull of the present. Her vow was clear, but her heart was no longer hers to command. One evening, when the sun had barely slipped behind the mountains and the sky still glowed with the last light of day, they found themselves alone. The silence between them was heavier than words. She wanted to speak, to remind him that she had sworn never to forgive, never to forget. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with the memory of his hand steadying hers, of his eyes watching her not with the malice she expected, but with something she could not name. He stood close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breath, and she felt her own heartbeat falter in response. She thought of her vow, of the promise she had made to herself when her world had been broken. She clung to it, even as her heart betrayed her, because to give it up would mean admitting that she no longer knew who she was. Yet as the wind shifted and carried the scent of smoke from some distant fire, she realized that vows and hatred could not stop the land from changing,
eyes nor the heart
from answering a call it did not understand. He reached for something then, not her hand, not her face, but the small leather strap she wore around her wrist. It had belonged to her father, a relic of a life she thought long gone. His fingers brushed against hers as he held it gently, almost reverently, and in that simple touch, the walls she had built trembled, wanted to snatch it back, to put space between them, to remind herself of the line she could not cross. But her body betrayed her resolve, and she stood frozen, caught between defiance and surrender. The air thickened, the silence deepened, and in that fragile moment, she felt the truth pressing in from every side. The vow that had once felt so strong now seemed like a thin veil, ready to be torn apart by a single choice. Her chest ached with the weight of it. For the first time she feared not what he might do, but what she herself might allow. And just as she thought she might speak, she might give voice to the storm inside her. The distant sound of horses thundered across the plains. Shadows moved along the ridge, and the warning came too late. The night was no longer theirs, and the choice she had tried to avoid would have to be made in the heat of danger. Her heart raced as she looked at him, torn between everything she had sworn and everything she was beginning to feel. The fire she had tried so hard to deny now burned brighter, and she knew nothing would ever be the same. The pounding of hooves grew louder, rolling over the plains like a storm. She tightened her grip on the reins, her heart racing faster with each passing second. He did not move at first, only stood with that steady calm that seemed carved into him, as though danger was an old companion he no longer feared. Then, without a word, he stepped closer to her, his presence both unsettling and grounding at once. She wanted to ask who was coming, what it meant, but the look in his eyes silenced her. It was the look of a man who already knew trouble was on its way. The riders broke over the ridge in a blur of dust and dark shapes, their shouts echoing across the open land. She could not see their faces yet, but she knew enough from the sound of their approach that they were no friends. Fear pressed in, mingling with the fire that still lingered from the moment just before, when his touch on her wrist had nearly undone her vow. The air itself seemed to crackle with unease. He gave her no explanation, only motion for her to follow. His horse was already moving before she could ask questions. Instinct told her to resist, to demand answers. But instinct also told her that if she stayed still, she would not survive the night. Against her pride, she urged her horse forward, keeping close behind him as they slipped into the folds of the land where the tall grasses and rocky shadows offered cover. They rode hard until the shouts of the riders dulled into the distance. She kept her eyes fixed on his back, her thoughts tangled between relief and resentment. Who were those men, and why had he seemed to expect them? What did it mean that he carried her to safety without asking, as if her will had no say? She wanted to hate him for it, but the truth was simpler and far harder to admit. Again, when they finally stopped, the prairie stretched quiet and empty around them, only the whisper of the wind breaking the silence. He dismounted with ease, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. She stayed on her horse a moment longer, her pride resisting the urge to thank him. The vow she had clung to felt thin after what had just passed, and she feared that if she spoke too freely, she would betray the storm inside her. Instead, she asked the question that burned in her chest. Who were they? Her voice carried more edge than she intended, but she could not take it back. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable, and then looked back toward the ridge.
Ow.
Men who take what they want, he said simply. Not Apache, not settlers, just scavengers. She frowned, unsettled by the ease with which he spoke of danger. And why did they follow us? His silence stretched too long, and in that silence she felt the unease deepen. He finally met her eyes, his own calm but guarded. Because they think I have something worth taking. She wanted to demand more, but the way he spoke told her that he would not give it. He was a man who held his secrets close, and she feared what it meant that those secrets had already pulled her into their path. As night fell, they made camp near a cluster of cottonwoods, the faint trickle of a creek nearby. The fire was small, hidden from view, its smoke barely a thread against the dark sky. She sat across from him, watching as he worked with quiet efficiency, his hands steady and practiced. He said little, and she found herself wondering again what stories lay behind that silence. She wanted to believe her hatred could remain firm, but here in the flicker of firelight, she saw more than an enemy. She saw a man shaped by hardships she could not yet name. The memory of her vow pressed heavy on her. She'd sworn to hate him, sworn it with every part of herself. Yet here she was, sharing fire with him, relying on him to keep her safe, when the world outside pressed close with shadows and threats. It felt like betrayal, not of him, but of herself. To push the thought aside, she asked about the land, about the people who once roamed it before the fences and towns rose. He spoke then, not much, but enough for her to hear the weight in his voice. He told her of trails that carried no footprints now, of rivers that once sang freely before the settlers dammed them. His words carried no bitterness, only truth, and that truth unsettled her more than anger might have. She listened, though she did not admit it aloud, because something in his voice touched a part of her she had long tried to bury. She thought of her father, of his stories of the first years on the land, of the warnings he gave her to never trust the Apache. But her father's voice was long gone, and this man's words were here now, weaving themselves into the cracks of her certainty. The night deepened, stars spilling across the sky in 1,000 tiny fires. She lay awake, the blanket pulled around her, and listened to the quiet breathing of the horses, the faint shift of wind through the trees, and his low hum as he kept watch. Sleep would not come, because her thoughts were too loud. She thought of his hand on hers, the way it had felt not like possession but like steadying. She thought of the riders, the danger that had come so close, and the strange calm he carried even in the face of it. By dawn she knew one truth she could not ignore. Whatever path she had thought her life would follow, it was already broken. This man, this Apache she had sworn to hate, was now tangled into her story, whether she wanted him there or not. The days that followed only deepened the mystery. They traveled together, moving from one quiet stretch of prairie to another, never staying too long in one place. She realized quickly that he knew the land in a way she never would. He could read signs in the soil, follow the faintest tracks, sense danger before it appeared. It was both unnerving and oddly comforting, knowing he could see what she could not. Yet the danger never seemed far. Once they came upon the smoking remains of a wagon train, its ashes still warm. No bodies lay in sight, but the silence of it chilled her. She saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes lingered on the ground, and though he said nothing, she felt the weight of what he carried. Another time, gunfire echoed faintly from the hills, and he steered them away without explanation. It was as if the land itself was restless, filled with threats waiting just beyond the horizon. She wanted to ask why he stayed near her, why he had not left her behind once she was safe. But each time the words rose in her throat, they withered before she could speak them. She feared the answer as much as she feared the question. Perhaps he had his reasons, reasons tied to the scavengers who hunted him, or to the relic she carried from her father. Perhaps it was something else, something neither of them was ready to admit. Every night, the fire between them burned small, but steady, and every night her vow grew harder to hold. She told herself it was only survival, only necessity, but her heart whispered otherwise. His silence, his steadiness. The quiet strength in his presence it all pressed against the walls she had built, daring them to fall. And though she fought it with everything she had, she could not deny the truth. Something was coming. Something greater than her vow, greater than the danger that followed them, greater than the fire she felt when his eyes met hers across the flames. Yet for now the mystery remained, thick as the shadows of the frontier night. She did not know who hunted him, or why fate had tied her to his path. She did not know if the fire in her heart was salvation or ruin. She only knew that the story was far from over, and that the next turn in the trail might change everything. The morning after the wagon train ruins, she woke to find him already gone from the campfire. Panic struck her before reason returned. She scanned the horizon until she spotted him near the creek, crouched low with his hand pressed to the ground. He looked as though he were listening to something beneath the soil. When he arose and came back, his face gave away little, but the silence between them told her all she needed to know. Trouble was closer than either of them wanted. She wanted to demand an explanation, to force words out of his quiet resolve, but something about the look in his eyes stopped her. It was not fear, no. He never seemed afraid. It was a guarded weight, as though he carried knowledge he wished he did not. She hated the way it made her feel small, left out of a truth that might crush her if she knew it. Still, she followed him when he signaled it was time to move, because what choice did she really have? The plains stretched endlessly, a land that seemed to breathe with its own secrets. They passed through tall grasses that swayed like waves, through canyons where echoes whispered from the stone walls, and over ridges where the wind sang sharp and cold. Each place carried its own kind of silence, and each silence seemed to feed the questions she dared not ask. Who were those scavengers? Why did they hunt him? And why, out of all the people they could have taken, had fate tied her path to his? At night, while the fire cracked low, she sometimes thought of her family, of the homestead where she had grown up. She thought of her father's warnings, her mother's gentle voice, her brother's laughter that had once filled the air like music. Those days felt like another lifetime, far away from the shifting shadows of the land she now crossed. The vow she had made in those days still echoed inside. Her never forgive, never trust, never yield to the ones who had brought ruin. And yet each day in his company tested that vow in ways she had never imagined. Once, as they rode through a grove of cottonwoods, she caught him studying her when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze lingered not with judgment but with something else, something softer. It made her chest tighten, though she told herself it was only anger. She wanted to ask him what he saw when he looked at her, but the words stayed locked behind her teeth. The danger pressed closer as days went on. They found tracks near the creek where they had drawn water, too many for wild hunters, too organized for wanderers. He said little, only motioned for them to keep moving, but she noticed the way his hands stayed near his weapon, his eyes scanning every shadow. That night, sleep would not come. She lay awake listening to the fire crackle, and when she turned her head, she saw him awake as well, staring into the dark as though he could see beyond it. A part of her wondered if he feared more than the men who hunted them. Perhaps there were ghosts of his own people that haunted him, battles fought and losses carried in silence. She thought of the way he spoke of the rivers and trails that had once been free. Of the grief in his tone, though, his face never showed it. He was a man divided, belonging fully to neither world, carrying scars that had no voice. And maybe in some way she understood him more than she wanted to admit. It was on the fourth evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, that they came upon a small settlement. The town looked worn, little more than a cluster of shacks and a saloon with faded paint. The people there glanced at them with suspicion, whispers following their steps. She felt every stare, the judgment heavy as stone. It wasn't only her they looked at, it was him. She saw the way their eyes sharpened, the way hands twitched near belts, and she realized again how deep the divide ran. They stopped at the saloon for water and supplies. The room fell silent the moment he walked in. Men at the bar turned, their eyes hard, and though no words were spoken, the air carried threat. She felt it press against her skin, prickling and cold. For the first time, she wondered if the danger that followed them came not only from the riders, but from every corner of a land that still held hatred like a wound that refused to heal. A man stepped forward, broad-shouldered and red-faced, his hand resting near his holster. "We don't take kindly to his kind here," he muttered. The room tightened, chairs scraping as others shifted to watch. She expected him to fight back, to snap words sharp enough to cut. But he only stood there, still and silent, his gaze steady. The restraint unnerved her more than anger would have. She felt the tension swell until she could hardly breathe, then forced herself to speak. "We only came for water," she said, her voice firm though her heart pounded. The man sneered but finally stepped back, muttering under his breath. They filled their canteens in silence, the weight of eyes following every move. She could not shake the thought that violence had been only a breath away, that at any moment the fragile thread could snap. When they left, the air outside felt easier to breathe, but the memory of those stares lingered. On the trail again, she could not hold her tongue. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked, anger sharpening her words. He glanced at her, his face unreadable. "Words don't change a man's heart," he said. The simplicity of it struck her, though she wanted to argue. He carried truth in that silence, and she hated that she understood it. She hated more that she felt his calm press against the storm inside her. The journey stretched on, each mile tightening the knot of mystery. She began to notice things she had overlooked before, the way he paused at certain landmarks, as though they meant more to him than to anyone else. The way he studied the horizon with a look that was not just caution but recognition. She wondered if he led her somewhere, or if they both were being led by something unseen. One night, as the wind howled low across the plains, he finally spoke more than he ever had. He told her of a village long gone, of people scattered, of betrayal from within and war from without. His words were not polished or grand, but raw and plain, each syllable heavy. He spoke of choices made and prices paid, of the loneliness that came with surviving when others did not. She listened in silence, and for the first time, she felt the weight of his scars press into her own heart. When he finished, the fire crackled between them, and she could not find words to answer. She wanted to reach for him, to tell him that she understood loss too, that the wound of it never truly healed. But the vow she had carried since her youth still held her back, a chain she could not yet break. The next day, as they crossed a ridge, smoke rose in the distance. The sight made her stomach twist. It was too much like the stories she had grown up with, too much like the memories whispered by old voices around the fire. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied the dark column rising into the sky. "We're not alone," he said, and the tension in his tone told her this was no chance encounter. Her heart pounded as she followed his lead, the silence stretching taut between them. Every step forward deepened the mystery, every mile pulling them closer to a truth she was not sure she wanted to face. The vow she had sworn and the fire she felt warred inside her, tearing her in two. She knew the conflict ahead would not only test their survival, but the very core of who she was. And as the smoke thickened, curling into the sky like a warning, she realized something with a chill. The danger was not only outside, waiting in the shadows. It was inside her too, burning in a heart she could no longer trust. The smoke rose heavier the closer they rode, curling into the sky in thick bands that carried the bitter scent of ash. She felt the air grow sharp in her lungs, and though she tried to steady her breathing, fear pressed hard against her chest. He rode ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his silence more telling than any words could be. Every line of his body was tight with readiness, and she could see his hand hover near his weapon, prepared for what waited. When they reached the ridge, she froze. Below them, the remains of a small settlement smoldered. Blackened frames of cabins leaned inward like broken ribs, and smoke hissed from fires not fully dead. There were no voices, no sound but the crackle of wood and the wind cutting through the ruins. She swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. The memory of her father's warnings came rushing back, and for a moment, the weight of the vow she had carried since childhood felt heavier than ever. He scanned the scene with careful eyes, guiding his horse down the slope. She followed, though every step of her mare felt like walking into a grave. The closer they came, the stronger the stench of ruin. Ash drifted across the ground like snow, coating their boots as they dismounted. He crouched low, touching the earth, studying tracks. His silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Finally she asked, her voice hoarse, "Who did this?" He looked up at her, his expression grim. "Not Apache, not settlers. The same men who hunted us." The words tightened her chest. Those riders, they weren't just shadows chasing him. They were a storm cutting through the land, leaving destruction behind. She thought of the scavengers, of the whispers in the saloon, and the way every trail seemed to carry danger near. Suddenly, the truth pressed down with suffocating clarity. She wasn't simply traveling with him. She was tied to the path of something much larger, something that threatened everything in its way. They searched the ruins, the silence broken only by the creak of charred beams and the distant cry of a hawk. She found small signs of life that once had filled the place: a child's doll half buried in soot, a cast-iron kettle blackened but whole. Her throat ached as she turned away, clutching the edges of her blanket tighter around her shoulders. He stood at the edge of the settlement, staring north where the tracks led. His face was carved with a stillness that carried both sorrow and resolve. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with unasked questions. "You knew they were close?" "Yes," he answered, his tone flat. "But not this close." The weight of it pressed heavy on them both. She wanted to demand why he hadn't told her more, why he kept so much hidden, but the words stuck in her throat. A part of her feared that if she pushed, she might learn truths she wasn't ready to carry. Instead, she stood beside him, silent, staring into the same horizon that seemed to swallow them whole. That night, they camped in a canyon, the fire hidden between tall rocks. The shadows stretched long, and though she tried to rest, every sound in the darkness pricked her nerves. She could not shake the image of the ruined settlement, silence of its ashes, the promise of more to come if they failed to stay ahead. He sat near the fire, sharpening his blade in slow, steady motions. She watched him, her heart restless. He had become more than a stranger, more than the enemy she had once sworn to despise. He was a wall between her and the chaos pressing in. Yet the closer danger crept, the more she feared what it meant that her life now hung on his. As the fire dimmed, he finally spoke, his voice low. "They will not stop. Not until they take what they came for." She met his eyes, the question bursting before she could stop it. "And what is it they want?" He paused, and for a heartbeat she thought he might not answer. Then his gaze dropped to the leather strap at her wrist, the relic of her father she had carried since childhood. Her breath caught, her mind raced, pieces falling into place. The riders had come after him, but it was not only him they hunted. It was her too, or at least what she carried. "This?" she whispered, clutching the strap. His silence was enough. Anger and fear twisted in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it would not have changed what we must do," he said quietly. His calm stung her more than any sharp words. She wanted to scream, to tell him he had no right to drag her into this, no right to keep her blind. Yet deep down, she knew the truth. From the moment their paths crossed, she had stepped onto this trail. And now there was no turning back. The days that followed blurred into a constant tension. They moved quickly, weaving through canyons, crossing rivers, leaving no trace behind. She learned to listen as he did to the rustle of branches, the shift of animals, the faintest crack of sound in the distance. She grew restless under the weight of silence, yet with each mile she felt herself change. Her vow to hate him burned less bright, replaced by something far more dangerous: trust. Still, the danger pressed closer. They found tracks again and again, always too near. Once they caught the echo of voices carried on the wind. Another time the flash of steel on the ridge above made her heart leap, though no attack came. It was as though the riders toyed with them, circling closer, waiting for the right moment to strike. She began to see the strain in him too. His silence grew heavier, his eyes sharper, as if he carried a weight only he could bear. Sometimes at night, when the fire was low and his face was shadowed, she thought she glimpsed sorrow carved deep in his features. She wanted to reach out, to tell him she saw it, that she carried sorrow too, but the words never left her lips. The tension built with every step, every mile. The prairie itself seemed to hold its breath, the skies darker, the wind sharper. She felt caught between two fires, the vow she had made to never forgive and the blaze in her heart that only grew stronger each time his gaze met hers. It was on the night of the storm that everything tightened to its breaking point. The sky split with thunder, rain crashing in sheets as they found shelter beneath a rocky overhang. Lightning carved the horizon, lighting his face in stark relief, his eyes fierce and unyielding. She stood close, shivering, not only from the storm, but from the storm inside her. The roar of the rain hid their words, but he leaned close, his voice firm in her ear. "They are here. I can feel it." Her blood ran cold. She gripped the strap at her wrist, the truth of what bound them now heavier than ever. Outside, thunder rolled again, and in its echo came another sound, the distant thunder of hooves. Her heart raced, her body frozen between fear and something far more dangerous. She looked at him, searching his eyes for answers, but all she found was the same steady resolve that had carried them this far. The storm raged, the riders closed in, and she knew the trail had brought them to its edge. Whatever came next would break everything open, her vow, her fear, her fire, and of it would remain untouched. The storm broke over the canyon with a fury that matched the pounding in her chest. Rain lashed the earth, Thunder roared like the sky itself was splitting, and lightning carved the night into sharp white flashes. The riders came with the storm, their silhouettes appearing through the sheets of rain, their shouts rising above the roar of water and wind. She clutched her father's leather strap at her wrist, the relic that had become the center of everything, the reason these men hunted them, the reason her life had been pulled into the path of an Apache she had sworn to hate. He stood beside her, unshaken, his eyes fixed on the shadows approaching. The calm in his stance gave her courage she did not know she had. For a moment she thought of how far they had come together. From the first time his hand had steadied hers, to the countless nights spent by fires that burned too low for comfort. Hatred had been her vow, but the truth was written in every glance they had shared. He was not the enemy she had once believed. He was the anchor that had held her steady when the world threatened to tear her apart. The fight came fast. Steel clashed in the lightning's glare, hooves tore through the mud, and voices rose in a chaos of fury. She fought not with weapons, but with will, doing everything she could to survive, to hold on to the strength he had taught her in silence. He moved through the storm like it was an old song, his blade swift, his eyes sharp, his presence unyielding. Together they held the line, until the last of the riders broke and scattered into the rain-soaked night. When the storm passed, the land lay scarred and silent. Broken branches scattered across the ground, rain still dripping from the rocks above. She stood trembling, mud streaking her clothes, the strap at her wrist slick with water. He sheathed his blade, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, but his face carried the same calm as before. They had survived, but survival was not the end. She turned to him, the question heavy on her lips. Why? Why do they want this so badly? She held up the strap, the leather worn smooth from years of her father's use. He studied it, his gaze steady, his voice low when he answered. It is more than a relic. It marks a bond, a promise once made between your father and my people, a promise of peace. They hunt it because it proves that peace was once real, and if it is remembered, their power fades. Her breath caught. She thought of her father, of the quiet way he had carried himself, of the stories he never told. All this time she had believed her vow was built on hatred alone. But now she realized it had also been built on silence, on the pieces of truth hidden from her. The leather strap was not only a reminder of loss, but a key to a story larger than her own grief. She sank to the ground, the weight of it pressing down. All this death, all this fear, for something my father never spoke of? He crouched beside her, his voice softer. Some truths are carried in silence because they are too heavy for words. But the land remembers, the people remember, and now you do too. The fire she had fought inside herself for so long shifted. Hatred had been her shield, but it no longer fit. She looked at him, the man she had once sworn to despise, and saw not an enemy, but a bridge between two worlds. His silence, his steadiness, his scars, they were not threats, were truths waiting to be seen. In the days that followed, they moved on from the canyon, the storm's scars fading into the vastness of the prairie. The riders did not return, their power broken by the fight, their grip loosened by the truth that had come to light. She carried the strap not as a weight of fear, but as a symbol of something larger, a promise, a chance to begin again. The town they reached at last was not much different from the others they had passed, a scatter of wooden buildings, faces hardened by life on the frontier, eyes quick to judge. But she no longer felt the same fear in their stares. She walked taller now, the leather strap at her wrist no longer just her father's memory, but her own claim to a story that refused to be erased. He walked beside her, silent as always, but she could feel the strength of his presence, steady as the earth itself. People whispered, as they always had, about the Apache who walked among them, about the woman who rode with him. Some voices carried suspicion, others curiosity, but none dared to step too close. She let them whisper. Their words no longer held power over her heart. At night, when the stars stretched wide over the land, she thought of the vow she had once sworn. She thought of the fire she had fought so hard to deny. And she thought of him, the man who had stood beside her when the storm broke, who had carried truth in silence until she was ready to hear it. The vow of hatred was gone, burned away by the fire of survival. By the strength of his touch, by the truth revealed in the storm's fury. She knew the frontier would never be easy. There would always be danger, always division, always the struggle between old wounds and new beginnings. But she also knew this: she was no longer walking through it alone. She carried her father's promise now, not as a burden, but as a torch. And by her side was the man she had once sworn to hate, now the one her heart trusted most. The prairie stretched wide before them, endless and untamed. Its silence no longer frightening, but alive with possibility. She did not know where the trail would lead, or what trials still waited beyond the horizon. But she knew one truth above all others, that the fire of hatred could destroy. But the fire of understanding could build something new. As they rode on together, the wind carried the scent of sage and rain, and in its voice she heard not fear, but promise. The promise of a life no longer bound by old vows, but lit by the blaze of a heart finally free to choose.